at kind of individual cases and make inferences
Right.
based on them. And based on my inferences, based on what I've read, and I can tell you some of the things that I looked at to make those inferences, I would guess the percentage of asymptomatic cases is about 30%.
Okay.
So if you like, I can give you a couple examples.
Yeah. So how would we be able to see how we could arrive at that number?
Yeah. So and by the way, I'll also tell you about the death rate. I would guess that the death rate is in a first world country where the medical system does not get overwhelmed. I would guess that right now the real death rate is about 1%. If we develop better treatments for it, not a cure, but better treatments, the
Right.
death rate could go somewhat below 1%. So it'll still be, unless there's a bombshell treatment, it'll still be definitely higher than the flu, but probably, less than 10 times higher than the flu once
Right.
we get our act together. But right now, it probably is about 10 times higher than the flu.
Yeah.
How did I get the 30%? There's multiple ways. Because there was one time, and maybe some people are still speculating it, but there was a time when there was a lot of speculation that it's got like 90% asymptomatic carriers, and that actually it's not that big of a deal. And I was wondering if this was true myself, but I was very suspicious about that speculation. If it had 90% asymptomatic carriers, then it's not really more deadly than the flu. It's just a lot more contagious.
Right.
Then it wouldn't be such a big deal. But here's the one good example of the number of asymptomatic carriers is, I forget the name of the cruise ship, but the Carnival Cruise Line's ship that
Yeah.
had a huge infection. You just need a simple random sample
Yeah.
that tests everyone in that sample, and then voila, you know how many of them had symptoms, how many didn't, how many died, how many survived. And I believe there were, don't quote me on this exactly. I guess you are quoting me on it right now.
Well, not
It's on
exactly.
video.
But yeah.
But I won't commit to this exact number, but I think they had in the ballpark of 30% asymptomatic carriers.
Okay.
It was not outside of that ballpark. It might not have
Right.
been exactly 30, but it was in that ballpark. And they tested everyone on that ship. That ship probably had an older crowd because it was a cruise line, and older crowds tend to be more symptomatic than younger people.
Yeah.
But that gives you a pretty statistically determined ballpark of the number of asymptomatic carriers. So if that ship had 30%, then the ship that has had 90% has sailed.
Right.
You like my metaphor there? So
Yeah.
it's not going to be 90% if they had 30% on that ship. And then there's some other examples. There's some other examples that are kind of also of that nature. So it's very unlikely with those examples, just from the way statistics work, it's essentially impossible that it's going to be 90%. If it is 90%, you should fire me. But that's what it turns out to be. But I think it's extremely unlikely it's 90%. Another reason that I was immediately didn't want to believe that it was 90% was, if you look at some of the countries that appear to have really gotten it under control, especially South Korea, they got it under control by thoroughly testing and tracing. Or one of their top techniques was thorough testing and tracing. So anytime someone had it, they tested anyone that person's been in contact with, and they isolated everyone until the virus ran its course. So if there were 90% asymptomatic carriers, then the virus could go in stealth mode for a long time and pop up who knows where all the time, and testing and tracing would be incredibly difficult to do successfully. Other reason is the way that it broke out in the United States. For weeks, we basically were able to trace the origins of every case, and they kind of started on the coasts and worked their way inwards.
Yeah.
If there were 90% asymptomatic, it took a long time before we had the first community-based case.
Right.
If there were 90% asymptomatic carriers, that's pretty inconceivable. We'd have unexplained cases popping up all over the place,
Right.
and there's no way in hell we'd be able to trace it. So that's why I think and that's why I think the number is not a lot higher than 30. I'm quite confident about that. Although there is the one possibility that you could have had that asymptomatic carriers are just not contagious. But I think there's studies available that show they are contagious, not as much, but they're still contagious.
Yeah.
So that's why it's mathematically kind of inconceivable that there is that there's a majority of asymptomatic cases, but there are also studies that, such as the cruise ship and other studies, that clearly show there are asymptomatic cases. And there's studies in China, which you have to take with a grain of salt. And mortality rate. Why do I think it's about 1%? Again, I think Korea is the best example.
Yeah.
There's other good examples. There's several countries where we have reason to believe that they have successfully. The best way to see the mortality rate is if you look at a country where you can accurately estimate the percentage of their real cases that they've documented.
Right.
In the United States, it's really hard to tell how many cases we've actually had.
Right.
So it's hard to tell the actual mortality. It's probably fair to say that most of the people that actually died from the virus, we've realized that they died from the virus as opposed to thinking they died from something else. But our error is where we can't really tell how many people have had the virus and not reported it. In Korea, because they were so good about testing and tracing, and they actually managed to keep their country running more or less in a business as usual sort of way, certainly a lot closer than us.
Yeah.
They did this by correctly testing. If they hadn't tested a large number of their cases that were positive, then they wouldn't have gotten it under control. Therefore, it stands to reason that they must have tested the majority of their positive cases, and therefore, you can estimate that the proportion of their positive cases that died in their medical system did not get overwhelmed, and they have a pretty first world medical system. So you can estimate that their fatality rate is pretty close to the real fatality rate. They probably missed some cases, but not too many.
Yeah.
And so, based on I think they missed some cases, but not too many. That's the ballpark. So based on Korea, I would say probably about 1%. And there's some other similar examples, but I think Korea is the best example of that figure.
And sort of continuing on that topic, looking forward, what kind of solution do you propose to sort of help this crisis?
It's not. I don't want to take the best solution that I have seen is certainly. Well, I guess I had the idea in the very beginning. I'm not the one that officially proposed it. I think this is actually the solution that the first world is now doing, even though they haven't made as far as I know, haven't made a formal announcement that this is the solution they're doing.
Right.
Which is very odd to me that they would have the solution, not make a formal announcement. Maybe it's because they're still trying to figure out how to implement it and they're being cautious, but I don't like the idea of keeping everyone in the dark. So this is the solution that I think we're now implementing. I also think it is the best solution. It's the best one that I know of. You never know. Maybe there's a better way to do it, but it's the best solution I know of. And in the very beginning, when China was getting it under control, I think they actually did get it under control originally. Who knows what's going on now?
Right.
My guess is that it's not. If I had to guess about China, I would guess it's not rampantly out of control in China. I think if they got it under control once, they could get it under control again.
Yeah.
But it might be a lot worse than they told us it is. But I don't think it's apocalyptic in China. And if it was, it would be really hard for them to keep that a secret.
Right.
It's a big country. What was I saying? And basically, when China first, at first I was wondering, when China really put the hammer down and had extreme measures to, and this is when we were first talking about flattening the curve, and then China did its extreme measures and completely destroyed the curve. Right. And I was like, why is China doing that? They're not following flattening the curve. I thought flattening the curve was the best solution. And so then I realized one of two things is going to happen with them. One, they're idiots, and then some Europeans are going to come back into their country and reinfect them, which they did. And then the curve will have exponential growth again, because you cannot, something people need to realize, and if I'm wrong, it'll turn out I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm not wrong. You can't stop it entirely. There's just too many places where the virus can pop up. We cannot cooperate as a planet so well that we just stop it entirely just by isolating people.
Right.
We can't get rid of every possible case, and as long as we don't get rid of every possible case, the moment we go back to business as usual with no additional restrictions, the pandemic is going to start again. So why would China try to destroy the pandemic entirely if then going to business as usual, pandemic would start again? And it did start again in China. I figured either they were idiots or they were going to try a strategy similar to testing and tracing. And that maybe that was possible. That was way in the beginning.
Right.
So it wasn't public knowledge, at least in the United States, it wasn't public knowledge whether testing and tracing could work back then. But it just kind of stood to reason that either it's going to come back or they must have a long-term plan, and their long-term plan would be, if they're really meticulous about tracing it, they can as soon as it starts popping up, they can isolate that little region and isolate the individual cases and keep it from exploding again.
Yeah.
So that was my theory. Since then, there's been a lot of evidence that actually does work, and that China actually, I think they used more draconian methods to get it under control than they needed to, but that they had the right idea. It looks like they had the right idea to begin with. Your question was, what do I think we're going to do now, or what do I think is the best strategy?
Yeah, the best strategy.
My answer for both those questions would be the same, because I think we're doing the best strategy now.
Okay.
So, more or less, I think we're being kind of, I think it took us a while to figure out what we were doing, and I hope we actually do know what we're doing. I don't think there's been any official government announcement that we're following the best strategy, so I'm just speculating that we're probably following the best strategy.
Right.
And obviously, if the government or other governments of the world were very smart, they would have done these studies about asymptomatic carriers and stuff like that a long time ago, because it's not very hard or very expensive. So you can't give them too much credit for following the best strategy. But I think in this case, I think it's going to be pretty clear that we will. To me, it seems pretty clear we're going to follow this strategy, and I think we'll be able to succeed in it. And basically, it's in a nutshell, it's imitating what South Korea is doing. So in South Korea, they had a big outbreak. They were one of the first outbreaks, but then they got it under control quickly, and they didn't shut down their whole country like the United States did. Mm-hmm. They have just been they've done some simple common sense, or some simple, not super expensive measures. I don't know if they're all wearing masks. Are they all wearing masks? They might be.
I'm not sure. On different, sources, you can see them saying that usually whenever they go to get tested, at least, they all wear masks. But in general, public, not too sure.
Okay, so I'm not sure about masks, but they were doing lots of other. They were being very good about testing and tracing. I think they had an app on everyone's phone where